Hi, it's Jen here. During the last month's video, I said that I like to use a lot of painted papers to do collage with. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at just some of the ways that I create these painted papers. So the first technique I'm going to look at is using ink and bleach. This is one of my favourite methods of working because it gives you such beautiful results. So I'm working on a fairly heavyweight watercolour paper here. I think it's 180 grams. And the first thing I'm going to do is just take a little bit of ink and dilute it quite a bit so that it's reasonably thin, and just drop it into the wet paper. So the joy of this is it doesn't matter. You can literally just let the ink bleed into the water. You can vary the strength of it, so you can bring some darker bits in. You can have some bits that are fairly simple where you've just put the colour on. And then I'm going to take a slightly smaller brush, and a bit of bleach, which I've added some water to. And this is quite wet at the moment. Normally I would let this dry a little bit more, because when you drop the bleach in, you'll see it just spreads the ink and makes it create, you get different colours starting to develop in it. It makes the ink move about. Now you can, if you're not happy with what you've done, go back in some more ink. And again, you see the colours start to change where there is a Joe bleach. Makes things happen to it. The joyous marks that you can achieve are just fabulous. And you will find simply changing the type of paper that you're working on will give you a different result altogether. So if I repeat the exercise, just on a piece of cartridge paper,
Are you using the bleach neat?
I'm adding water to it as I go. Advice tends to be that you should dilute the bleach by about 1/3, but I'm quite reckless. I throw it on sometimes and don't really thin it out that much. Again, my paper's not just as wet this time. But the marks are entirely different because of the change in the paper. It doesn't bleed in the same way at all. Even if I add more water to that, it doesn't do quite the same thing as it does on the watercolour paper. So it's worth playing about with different types of paper just to see what effect that has. And again, seeing what the bleach is going to do to it on there. It's quite nice what's going on there. Another thing that I will do is, especially with the wet strength tissue paper, and I like to just feel the wet strength tissue paper, it tends to have a sort of shinier side and a slightly more absorbent one. So sometimes I'll take pieces and just take the colour off there and see what that gives me on the tissue paper. And again, you can see you're getting really interesting sort of marks coming there. You could do the ink and bleach directly onto the tissue paper, which again gives you a totally different range of marks. Often when I'm working with bleach, I think, oh, actually I'd quite like a bit of colour in there, and I'll just dip into some watercolour and add that in, which can be quite interesting if you do that and then add the bleach to it, because I've had strange reactions with some of the colours, whether it's where the ink goes underneath the paint or the paint comes through, but you can see interesting things starting to happen there.
Is that strawberry watercolour?
It is, yes, just standard watercolour. Although another type of paint that I'll work with are Inktense paints. They just give you a stronger colour response really. So again, generally speaking, if I'm working with watercolour paints, I do tend to wet out my paper first of all, before I start. And as you can see, I'm not the tidiest when I'm doing this. And that's the joy of it, because like, if I stick that mark on there, and then think, oh, looks a bit of yellow, I've not even washed my brush properly, so that's starting to go green. But you get these accidental things that happen that are just incredible. So you can think, and you don't have to worry about what you're doing, so you've got such freedom to create differences in it. And then it may be that you end up just tearing out a tiny little section of that, and that's the bit that will enhance your work. Something else I use are Brusho, which are basically a powdered pigment, which if you sprinkle them on, they'll then bleed out and disperse in the colours, so you can create textures and surfaces doing that. It's really just about playing, and I think the most important thing to take from this is, I'll keep that bit that I've been working on top of. I will use that as one of my collage papers. So the most important thing to take from this is just to enjoy it. So if you put something on, you're not aiming to achieve anything. It doesn't matter what you're doing. What matters is that you keep looking at it as you work and think, actually, oh, I like where that sharp edge is coming, but there's a softness to it and how it's starting to travel down through the creases of the paper, or how one colour is interacting with another. And it's really just about celebrating the surface of it. Later on you can make the decisions what you're going to do with them. These don't have to be done with the purpose in mind in the first place.
Hello, it's Hilary Porter again. I'd like to show you a technique which I use a lot. I use it for making half felts to cut up in things or to embed in things, but I also use this technique at the beginning of almost everything I make, even if it's going to be something very thick and big. So I've laid out a base of wool fibre. It's carded, so I haven't had to shingle it. It's just like that, and fairly thin, but whatever. I'm going to lay some things on top, and just a variety of things to show you that this dry rubbing method does work with almost anything. So this is a wallpaper that's going on top. I've also got some silk hanky, which you probably know is difficult to handle because it sticks to your fingers. And I'm also going to put some silk page in. I call it page sometimes, but I think it's got other names, which I can't remember. Here we go. And then I'm going to add in some yarn. This is Frid, which is a lovely yarn to put in felt, embeds very well. Got some silk papers, which I'll pop in there, and also some of this wonderful jute. I think it's jute.
Jute scrim.
Jute scrim, that's what it is. I'm hoping that all of this sticks. In my experience, it should. Let's put that over there. So, having laid all that out randomly, you can do a pattern if you like, it does work. And then I'll just start rubbing. You have to have very dry hands for this, otherwise everything will come off on your hand. And what I like about this method is getting my hands in there, which I always like to do, and also you can feel the chemistry of the fibres getting through and sticking on these pieces that are embedded, that are laid on top rather. So you just have to keep rubbing gently, feeling it move against the bubble wrap so that you're getting friction from both sides, and you can turn it over and do it from the back. And you can actually see that the wool fibres are coming together and meshing.
Is the bubble wrap helping here? Because when we wet felt, we quite often use a thin plastic.
Yeah, the bubble wrap, I think it does help because it's a texture underneath, and because you want to feel the fibres and the pieces that you put in, you want to feel them sort of moving, and the bubble wrap helps with that. Right, you can see that it's quite well stuck now. You can lift it up and move it around. What I'm going to do now is roll it up, and I'm going to dunk it in some water, quite hot water. And then I will unroll it as carefully as I can. And this is where you can start moving it around. In fact, it needs a bit more water. And you can gently start rolling it. And this is just to firm it up a bit from having stuck the pieces down. And you just keep doing that one way or another. And eventually what you end up with, you can take it as far as you like, but you can use it as a piece like this, where you can see this is bedded in, the silk is in, these bits have been caught, but they're not entirely embedded. But this you could put in a piece as it is now, and it will felt really well into it and sink into it. But if you take it further, you can cut it up and keep the shapes of whatever you've cut up. What I really like to do is make a load of these if I've got nothing much else to do, and it's a good way of using up bits and pieces. And it doesn't really, for me, it doesn't really matter what colours I'm using, because I also like, in very thick pieces I make, I might use these underneath other layers of wool, so that it adds to the colour texture of the piece, and you'll get tiny bits of the colours and bits of the embedded threads and things coming through from underneath. So if it's really ugly, I still will use it, because you won't see it in all its ugliness, just little bits of it.
Hi, I'm Sue, and you may remember last month, if you were listening, I explained that I really liked mark making, and that was quite a significant part of my design. And I mentioned that as part of my mark making equipment, I made my own brushes to make these marks. So I thought I'd bring along a few of them and just actually show them to you. So they're all homemade. I use a variety of things. So for instance, the handles are all driftwood off our local beach, and I've used old fisherman's rope here that I've found and split out the fronds a little bit, and then they're just tied on or wrapped around really heavily with bits of fabric, and then I chose to give them all blue and orange colourways. So what I'll be showing you is how I just dip them into some ink and the various different marks that you can make with them. This one here is actually my favourite. It's another fisherman's rope. This has got really fine plastic threads on the end, so you get some really delicate marks with those. And I found a nice hefty chunky bit of driftwood to put that on, so you've got this lovely handle to be able to use. We live near the coast and stuff, so there are plenty of seagulls around. This is probably off a young herring or something like that. It's a baby feather, and you can get some really nice marks made out of feathers. They'll give you different marks. This one here is actually off a plant, and I'm not sure what the name of the plants are, but they're basically those ones with the great big spiky leaves, and you know, the leaf dries, and then you can actually peel the leaf into bits, and it peels off into these strands, which you then fix and attach to the end of the piece of wood. And you can see where I've used these, they've all had black ink on them before. This one's quite a fun one. I call this a dauber. This makes great big bold marks, and it's a piece of driftwood, and inside it's full of, actually I think what I did do was I cut up an old fleece and then wrapped a large piece of fleece around the top and bound it on and round it. You get nice dobbing marks with that. Here's one that's got slightly more delicate strands, and these are just bits of wool yarn which have just been attached, and it gives you these funny little fluffy sort of patterns. And then this is one that's great fun. This is actually, you can use this in two ways. The ways that I'll be showing you, and I'll be, hopefully if it works, I'll be dragging it along the piece of paper, and that will leave an imprint of some wool. The other thing that you can actually do is to actually use it as a whip. Now don't get the wrong idea about this, but if you fill the ends up with ink and stuff, you can slap the paper or slap whatever you're using. It's best done outside, because I can assure you the ink gets everywhere, but that's a great one to use as well. So I'll just get rid of the bits of dust. The inks that I use are acrylic ink. It's a company called Golden, and it's high flow acrylic, and I use that because it gives really vibrant colours that mix, but it's really smooth to use, and it's a really nice product to use. And you have to give them a really good shake. You'll probably hear the metal ball in this, because it doesn't sort of really separate, but it needs to be thoroughly mixed. And then what I'm going to do with this one is I'll just put some in the middle of this pan, and we'll pick you need quite a bit. You do actually go through this one particularly. It's a fair rate of knots. And please, if you are using them, make sure you put the top on properly, and not do like I did at home when I've forgotten to put the top on and ink was everywhere. So for this one, I'm going to use the plant one, and I'm just going to dip it in, pick up a little bit of ink without trying to splash it around too much, move that out of the way, and you can you don't think about it, you just sort of do what you want with it really, and it makes these lovely scratchy sort of marks. So you get quite a bit of delicacy, and if you really load it up, you can get some, more substantial marks. But this, I love this one because it sort of gives a great deal of movement there. The other one that's my favourite, I've just got rabbled up with the whip here, is the one that I described before. This is the one with the fisherman's rope on it, and again, if you just soak it, it'll probably come out with sort of slightly similar marks, but with this one you sort of end, they're just subtly different. It's more of a dabber really, because some of the fibres have stuck together with use. Like you get more dots out of that one. So I think what I'll do now is I'm just going to use this double one here. This gives really different marks. When these are freshly made, these daubers, they're actually very soft, and you actually get a really bold, quite a blobby mark. It's quite stiff at the moment because it's been used so many times. Some of it is actually set, so it's hard. It doesn't squish as much as it did when I first made it, but it gives me these really nice, very bold marks here. So you can use that. One of my favourites, I'm just going to change colour here. I'm going to put the blue in, so I just need to give it a bit of a shake, but we'll have a go with the feather and see what marks we can get out of that. Okay, so I'll just pop that so you can see here. I'm putting quite a bit in. You don't want to be too mean because otherwise it doesn't pick up enough ink. But here we have a feather, and you've got different size of it. So if you go along with the edge of the feather, you can make just really nice thin lines and then bring them out. It's like calligraphy really. Bring these beautiful swirly, or I suppose they look like waves really, waves. And because I'm going straight into the black ink, it's picking up some of the colour there, but it gives these really delightful, as the feather, I can't remember what they're called now, yeah, the fronds, as the feathers separate and stuff, because obviously it's losing the oil, they separate out, and you can just play around with that. So I'll probably come back to that one a little bit later as well. I'm just going to swap paper, otherwise we'll start getting a bit cluttered. Thank you. So nice clean bit of paper again here, and I liked the feather so much, I'm actually going to go back and then use it again, because I just really like. You can make it as big or as heavy as you want, but it gives these really quite intricate movements. You can just pick up paint on the dip on the end of it and make these little repetitive rhythms. They look like a whole load of little trees there to me on top of a hill. So you can find all sorts of ways of using things. Okay, then I think we'll go for a little bit of yellow, because if the alchemy fairies are with us, we might end up with a bit of a green. So again, you can probably just hear the metal ball in the bottle that's helping to mix the paints, and I'm going to put again a fair bit in that, so there's something for the brushes to pick up. So let's see if we can get this one to work. This is the one that I was telling you about. You can either use it as a whip or it'll pull things across. You can see where I've used it with black ink before, and you have to be a little bit patient with this one because it'll take a little while to soak up some of the yellow paint. But we'll have a play around with this and see whether it can just get a little bit on it there, and just separate that out. And again, when this is fresh, it's actually freshly made, it will give different marks. And certainly when I use this the first few times, you've got proper, well, you're getting them there as well actually, some really lovely lines with it. Let's been used quite a bit now, so they're not quite as definite, but they're still there. And the other one I was explaining about was the one where I just used bits of wool tied to the end. You can do all sorts with this one. This will pick up the ink quite nicely, and again you can sort of splodge it and do various things, or stroke it. And it's interesting because I'm already running out of acrylic there in terms of using it, and if you press harder you just get lots of just different splodges and splashes, and you basically just don't think about it, just play. That's the lovely thing about this, just playing. So I'm going to go back into the black here with the Fisherman one, trying to just load up the ends, but also because of the way you can use the brushes, it doesn't matter where you put the paint really, it's just where it's going to make contact. This is a little bit more scratchy, and I do like the scratchy marks, they're great fun. So again, I'm just going to go back into with the feather because I've got plenty of ink left, and it just makes such lovely swiffy patterns, curvy patterns as the ink gets used up. And of course when you go across the yellow ink, as long as it's still wet, it makes green. You can just play to your heart's content. So at some point when I finish, I'm trying not to do too much because it gets a bit cluttered, but again that doesn't matter. I'd go in and I'd just get a window, you know, a couple of bits of white L-shaped pieces of paper, and frame some of these things and just look for little vignettes on them to find something that was really pretty. And I thought, oh, well, that could be a weaving area. So again, just finding this feather and just finding a different edge or a different angle to use to give these lovely marks.
Last month you showed us how you'd done this with your rust, and you used your tools. And do you find that just because you've been looking, you naturally pick up a tool and it naturally makes those marks, or do you know the tools now well enough to be able to make marks that reflect your starting point?
Some things are straightforward, so if I want to do a circle or like a nail, we were talking about the nails on this shed, I will always use a cotton bud, those, because they're small. I've got one here which is a bit worse for wear, but if you can, you know, just use the end of the cotton buds. This is one of the old ones, it's still got plastic stalk to it, whereas new ones now have paint, so you just get these really fabulous dots. So if I want small dots, this is actually one of my favourites, but it wasn't a brush, so I didn't put it in the film. That's one of my favourite tools to use, actually, something really simple. And the other thing you can do with these is put a group of about 7 or 8 of them, just tie them up in the middle and make sure all the ends are at the same level, so you end up with this crown of cotton buds, and they all retain their own circular character, and it's like printing the middle of a flower, or you get a whole little bunch of dots together which print rather nicely and stuff. So some of the tools I know what they're going to do. The feather, I pretty much know what that's going to do, because you get these lovely triangular shapes and these lovely swiffy marks, as I call them. These are far more unpredictable because they go all over the place. The one with the plants, that's slightly more predictable, because again you can choose to have your grass prongs different lengths, or you could actually chop that off and have them all at the same length. I've just chosen to have them all at different lengths, so you can predict that to a certain extent. Certainly the ones with the fisherman's rope, and also this string one that I showed, which is rather stiffened up over age, they are much less predictable, but you know they're going to give you sort of like a flowing organic line.
Lovely, exciting, thank you.
Oh, hi, I'm Pat. I wanted to show you some of the work I've been doing around stitching. I was looking at the way in which stitch could improve the texture in my felt. I'm not an experienced stitcher, so I was starting as a beginner really. But this book by Susan Brandeis I found absolutely wonderful. And the things I like about it, the author was a lecturer on a university textiles course teaching stitch, and the book's a culmination of a work over many years. It's got the most fabulous illustrations, and one of the things I liked about it and that suited me was the fact that she uses simple basic stitches but in a really interesting way, I think. And in terms of the way she layers stitches, she uses colour, and they were aspects of her work that really appealed to me. So I started off actually literally learning the stitches, and then I wanted to test out what stages of felting the stitching the effects they would have at different stages. So I started off doing some stitching on very lightweight half felts, very soft half felts, maybe only had been felted once, one round of felting, and then I'd carry on and felt them till they were fully felted. And this one is an example of where I used overlapping cross stitches and couching, and I wanted to know really whether the stitches would make the felt come forward, would lift it, or would make it retract. And I was quite surprised to find that the couching retracted, because I expected that to become more prominent, but it virtually disappeared, whereas the overlapping cross stitch still gave quite a nice texture. So then I did another, this is another little one that was a very soft half felt that I did lots of running stitches on. And again, when it was fully felted, there was this lovely rippling effect that came through from the stitches, and I thought that's an effect definitely I like and I could use in different ways. Now this one was more of a medium felted piece of felt. It wasn't fully felted, and it's been hand dyed and printed on. And again, I did lots of running stitch, and because it was already firmer, the pattern of the stitches has remained. And again, I quite liked that, and I particularly liked the way using graduated colours of the embroidery threads enhance the colour underneath. I like using similar colours to the underlying felt, but maybe changing them slightly, and I think it gave it almost a luminescent sort of quality that I didn't really expect. Now, I think in contrast that this is a little sample that was fully felted when I stitched it. It's a little mosaic felt made out of Norwegian wool, so it was quite firm. And I used blanket stitch in, and I did refelt it even after I'd stitched, but the stitches sit on the top. And again, I quite liked that. But yeah, I thought it gave it a kind of certain movement that the underlying piece of felt didn't really have. You know, it was quite an ordinary little piece of felt, but I think the stitching definitely gave it something else that I could use again. Now this was a little experiment with dissolvable fabric, and I was wondering whether dissolvable fabric could be used for very, very soft half felts that could be stitched on and then put in layers, and maybe layers with different things. And this was 3 little samples. One that it was just layered with merino, and the middle one it was layered with scrim, and then the final one it was with Hessian netting, and the scrim one didn't really shrink anywhere near as much as particularly the merino one. And the merino one's got the distortion of the stitching, whereas the Hessian one was the one that kept both the stitching and the patterns of the stitching, plus the texture of the underlying material, which again I quite liked. I would definitely use the dissolvable fabric again, and maybe layer it up much more. In a similar vein, this was some dyed scrim, and I wanted to see whether stitching before it was laminated onto merino or afterwards would make a difference. And I think, as you can see, it made quite a big difference. This one on the left, the stitching was done after the lamination, and they're very distinct, the stitches, whereas on the one where the scrim was stitched before it was laminated, they virtually disappeared. But again, it's quite a nice crinkly effect where the stitches just pop out every now and again, and they're almost more like marks than stitches. So I think both of those I could use. Now, going on to some naturals, this was a Shetland sample, and it was a low relief sample, but that's got lots of bits in it, lots of slubs and bits of other threads and whatnot. But again, it was quite softly felted when I started stitching it. And I did lots of, it's actually very small couching on it. And then I did lots of overlaying of straight stitches. And as I'd found before, again, to my surprise really, the couching lines bedded into the felt when I refelted it. They became ridges, which I quite liked. Whereas all the layered straight stitches kept their contour and turned into something more of a relief, which again is what I was trying to achieve. So I would definitely do that again, the layering of stitches. Susan Brandeis does lots of layering of the same stitch, and this is an example where it's layering of blanket stitch, and again it's on another natural sample, natural Shetland, and it's the same effect has happened with the ridges where the couching was done, and this low relief where the layering of the blanket stitches has happened. I went and then I thought I'd try some darning stitch and Cretan stitch. This was actually from another book, and I found they made some quite nice bark type patterns, which again I thought I could use those again. And I used different thicknesses of embroidery thread. Most of this book I've used either embroidery thread of different thicknesses or frid, but subsequently I've gone on to use much thicker yarns, and this is a little example of that. These are yarns, spun yarns of different thicknesses, which I've then refelted, and they're giving me a much more textured effect. So there's lots more stitching that I think I'll be doing, because not only have I found it useful, it's actually been very enjoyable and relaxing.
Hi, I'm Sue and I'm a tapestry weaver, and I just wanted to show you some of the work that I've been doing. I've been exploring making slits in tapestry, and slits can be used for all sorts of useful things, but I was really at the very experimental stage. So I'll just run through my little sample book that I've got, where you can see these little marks here. They often appear as little shadows where the weft is just turned back on itself around the warp and makes these little gaps. Here's one where I've extended the slits down to the bottom of the tapestry, so it's actually not joined at the bottom. And as I got more adventurous, I actually did really quite long slits. And these can be quite useful. At the end of a tapestry, you could have little not tassels at the end, but little split pleats at the end, I think I'd probably call that. This one's a bit more difficult to see, but this was using nettle yarn, and there are actually some slits here in the fabric that I've made. Just turn that over like that. These slits were inspired by my attending an exhibition down at Tate Modern, and there's a lady called Magdalena Abakanovich who, there was a retrospect of all her tapestry work. She makes absolutely massive, huge bodies of tapestries, and I hadn't realised until I was able to look at them closely. She uses quite a few slits in her work, and along the edges of the selve edges, even though that's in the middle of a weave, she has these absolutely glorious long floats which give the edge some added texture, and she also does them on the ends. Now you have to remember that her tapestries are huge. They're larger than a person, and she uses rope and really thick things to create these lovely patterns and textures. Obviously I wasn't doing that, I was just doing small samples, but I didn't really know how she'd done it, and I tried to have a look at in the exhibition. Obviously you're not allowed to touch things, so this is all visual, but I sort of worked out my own way of how she may have done it and enjoyed experimenting with those. So here's another one. This again is in the nettle yarn, and it's got this lovely slit up the middle, but also I did some along the selve edges, and I just really enjoyed that style of work. So I'm going to be showing you how I do those in a few minutes. Just to finish off the book, there's some slits here that I've done using linen, and the linen and the wool just give really different characteristics with the weaving. Here's another one that's a bit more blocky and patchworky, so there's cotton and silk and linen in this one, with these slits that add shadows and shape to the tapestry. And then here's one where I sort of felt as though I really went to town on the end, because within some of the slits I put some of Magdalena's edging along those. So that's my book of samples of slit work. So I'm going to try and show you now how I do the fancy edges. So I've got my loom set up. It's not particularly important what wool and set I've used. It just happens to be set up at 5 ends per inch and stuff, and I've done it in a cream wool because I thought that would probably give you a better idea of how it's actually done. I'm just going to move that out of the way. So along the bottom I've just done some tabby weave along the bottom just to set it up, and my slit's going to go in the middle. I've already started it, and I've already started one side just to show you how this is actually going to come out here. I could of course put these floats on the selve edge as well, but it's just the same process. And what's really nice about this is there's no plan to it. It's just fun and quite not mindless, but quite it relaxes your brain as you're doing it, because you don't have to overthink it. So in these bits I'll just go under over, making sure I'm in the right shed, and just tap it down with my needle. If you haven't come across these needles, these are absolutely brilliant. They've got a little bend on them, and it just makes it so much easier when you're doing a tapestry like this. You can manipulate the weft far more easily. So what I'm going to do here is I've got 3 warps at the end, and I could go to the end, but that'll just give me more tabby weave, or I'm actually going to take it underneath all those 3 warps, pull it in gently, just a little bit careful. I don't want to pull the slit end in too much, but I could. And then I'm just going to go backwards to the end of that row, or that half pass. Just tap it in, remembering trying not to pull the self edges in, which is always easier said than done when you're concentrating on something else. Just tapping it down with the needle. And what you find is every so often you have to put in a full row of tabby, as I'll call it, because with you having that float there, they pack down more than the weft, so you can end up with really quite a wobbly line. And it doesn't matter in terms of structure, because obviously this is not going to be a structural piece. It's going to it's there for the effect, really, the fancy edge. So again, we've got a tabby weave going along in there, and then I'm just going to come back. I'm going to put a full tabby in this time. Remember that one there, the very first one I did that by taking the float over the top of the warp, and this one I've gone all the way to the end. And actually what I'm going to do here is I'm putting a little tabby in there, but I'm going to go over 4 warps this time. And I just have to be a little bit careful, because having said that, if I go over 4 warps, that's going to be another under, and the under actually needs to go there, because otherwise it's not going to be in the right shed. So do that, and then just finish off the pass with some more tabby weave, and then come back again. And you can make these floats, they can sit on top of each other. I think what I'll do, put another float in very close. So I've come all the way up to there. I'm going to wrap it round like that and just take it back. So I've got 2 floats sitting close to each other there, and it makes a bit more of a bulge. And then just coming back across, do a full tabby weave just to give that self edge some structure, or else it's going to be very, very floppy. And then just going back across again. So you can really play with this, and there's actually nothing to stop you. This is just beginning to dip down a little bit, you can see. So if I really wanted to, I could go back in again. I'll just give myself a bit more length, go under. So I've actually got 2 very, very close floats there. And you don't have to keep it straight. This can go all over the place, really. So it is quite liberating that you can just do what you want. You don't have to plan it. Just have a bit of fun. And again, I'm just going to put a tabby in there just to firm that edge up. And if I wanted to, I could put a float in here just further across, and it just adds texture into those areas. So I've got a float there. So it is really liberating to be able to put floats in, because obviously when you're doing a plain weave, it's so frustrating when you've done a lot of weaving and you look down at what you've done and there's a float there that you then have to deal with when it's somewhere where you don't want it to be. So, whoops, just take that out with my fingers. So there you go. So hopefully that gives you some idea as to my way of trying to work out how Magdalena did her fancy edges to her slits.
It's Kate, and I want to show you how I'm exploring some techniques in tapestry. I did a workshop with Sue Lawty, which was just phenomenal, and she gave us this presentation that just went, we just blew our minds. And what she suggested was, having been inspired by all of these things, was to take one aspect and explore it. And I decided I would take one thread, and I was going to work with this linen thread that I had. And I don't normally work with plant fibres. I normally work with wool. So it's just really, really interesting to work with a plant fibre, but also the linen, because it's quite a long thread, a long fibre. So it is quite stiff and rigid
compared to wool, and I had to learn how to weave with it. And so I decided I would work at quite a wide set. I work at 6 ends to the inch, which meant I had to bundle, and I was bundling like 10 of those strands together to explore how it would weave. And I tried having the bundle and just weaving with it, but also twisting the bundle, and I found that that stood proud next to the flatness when you didn't twist it. I put in slits, and I looked at how I could sew those slits up and make like a scar. Here I've got slits, but I have woven in between with just a single strand, so it's much thinner and finer. And I actually burnished this. I rubbed it with a spoon or the point of my bobbin, the side of my bobbin, just to smooth it out and flatten it and soften it. I looked at some of Sue's work and saw these little connectors in her work, and I really liked those. And I thought she had woven them in. Turns out she's sewn them together, and they were sewn stitches, which makes me giggle a little bit. But you see something and it inspires you to do something, and I just really loved those little connectors and connecting the fine with the thicker, so that I was having to weave a number of passes in the fine to balance with one pass in the thicker, and then connecting through, sharing a warp thread so that you make a ridge, just playing with these real subtleties. Here I wanted to try and do a circle and put that in, and moving between the shared warp and then the single strand, wrapping and linking. Beautiful subtleties. So that was just exploring one thread and the subtle contrast that I could create through technique. I then went on to explore the linen. I'd fallen in love with linen by now, and I decided I would explore it further. And so I started to spin the linen, and I worked with it on a drop spindle. It's not something I had spun before. I needed one of my heaviest drop spindles to work with, and you need to work wet. So I found if I worked dry, it was very hairy, but I was able to get this little device for wetting your fingers if you're going to put a lot of stamps on or count papers or things like that. And I was just able to keep my fingers wet whilst I'm spinning, and I can run my damp fingers along the thread as I'm making it and just calm down the fibre. The fibre that I've got, the top that I'm working with, it's actually called tow. The fibres themselves are actually quite short. They've been cut, and that has made the spinning a lot easier for an absolute beginner. They can be up to 1 metre, 3 metres long, these fibres, but it was just a lot easier for me, used to spinning wool, to actually be able to spin the linen. But it does mean I've got quite a hairy linen thread. And when I sent photographs through of what I'd been exploring, Sue sort of went, "Oh, you're out of focus for that." I said, "No, I'm not out of focus. I've got a hairy thread because I've spun it myself, and it gives a fuzzy effect." But I'm really enjoying now playing with my hand spun and the industrial produced one. And I'm playing around with reverse sumac and the floats. I love the idea of the floats, and what I'm thinking about is the drawing that I showed you when we were looking at design, where I'd done abstract narrative and the movement in the reeds, and I want to look at how I can replicate some of those marks, and the paper and the hardness in areas and the softness in areas. I've put in little bits of silk as well. I've got a natural flax, which is a natural coloured linen before it's been bleached, and I've gradated along there to try and bring some colour in. but I've also brought some colour into my hand spun. And so one of the things that I did was to create hand spun, and this one I applied quite often. I will leave it as a singles and work with it, or I will ply it, and it's just a little length. It's damp because it's been spun and it's damp, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply just some little droplets of this wonderful natural dye that Helen Melvin makes from Fiery Felts, and they're absolutely beautiful, and they are the best thing I've found for dyeing linen. And linen is kind of notoriously difficult to dye, and I'm just using an old bronze there, and I'm just going to add some bronze which is a little bit greener, and just pop them in. And what I will do is leave that to dry and to travel, and just introduce the colour, and I'm overlapping some of the colours. I'm leaving some of it white as well, and I will leave that to dry, and then I shall wrap that in foil or cling film, or I could just put it in a little bowl on its own and steam it for 45 minutes, and then I'll be able to wash that off and weave with it, and it gives me this most beautiful colour that I can work with. So I'm starting to pick up on colours that I can work with for that piece as I'm sampling and trying out ideas with new materials, but thinking about smudges of colour, smudges of charcoal, of pastel, watercolour, things that are moving, so that I can start to find my drawn marks in tapestry.